I could make that argument for like so many different chains, and maybe there are apps sometimes, but the apps aren't differentiated, and there's like an oversupply of apps and an under demand of like people actually using the apps and like getting utility from the apps. So I kind of think right now where we are in crypto is like rethinking apps, I guess, and like demand for like what apps should even exist in the first place, and thinking very, very hard about that problem. And I think in general, if you manage to solve that problem, like I guess Hyperliquid did with the Perps exchange, you're in a very, very unique sort of place to build a platform on top of like the product itself.
Quick shout out to today's sponsor, Katana. We'll hear more about Katana's 1 billion cat campaign later today, but for now, let's get into the episode. Hey everyone, quick disclaimer before we get into today's episode. Nothing said on Bell Curve is a recommendation to buy or sell securities or tokens. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely our opinions, not financial advice. Our guests and I may hold positions in the companies, funds, or projects discussed. All right, everyone, welcome. I shouldn't say back to another episode of Bell Curve because this is a different Bell Curve Roundup than it's been in the past. But there's some familiar faces for longtime listeners of Bell Curve here. But this is the new Roundup, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit. But excited to welcome Myles O'Neill here and Xavier Megan. Guys, welcome.
Thank you very
Awesome to
much.
be here. Awesome to be back. But also, starting a fresh new Roundup here.
Yeah. Changes in the air. Very excited about this next generation here. And maybe we got a great show for you today, but to get into, just give like a couple seconds around how the Roundup is changing and how we're thinking about it moving forward. Two big changes to note. One has to do more with this Roundup. The other is just on the trajectory of Bell Curve in general as a show, which is we're not doing a news Roundup anymore. So we're going to tackle one topic, do a bunch of research, and go deep in the weeds on what that is. So today we're going to be talking about platforms. So how they've existed in Web 2 historically, how that maps over to Web 3, where it does and where it doesn't, and then go through a bunch of examples of gen purpose platforms, how they differentiate, how they go to market, and the lessons that we can learn from, 25 years of business that people have been ignoring for the most part in crypto. The other thing on Bell Curve is we are, Bell Curve endeavors to be thesis driven and on the zeitgeist of the moment. And for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been really, really deep in the weeds of infrastructure, and we did some great seasons on MEV and DEX design and things like that. We are going to zoom out here a little bit and actually try to look where crypto intersects with other big technologies. So AI, RWAs, that type of thing. And we're also going to talk more about business strategy, like go to market, leveraging open source in a competitive way, and try to adopt some of these lessons that are kind of table stakes in other industries and apply them to crypto. Because the thesis here is that we're in the scale up phase of crypto. And so maybe some of the technical details that we zoomed in on historically are less relevant than they used to be. And instead, it's going to be much more on picking the right strategy, executing in the right sector. So that's how you can understand the sort of changes to Bell Curve here. And I've got the two best guys in the industry to do with and my buddies. So I'm excited to be ripping this with you guys. Okay. Myles is the hero of this session. So you drove a bunch of this agenda, but I will just a level set on what we're going to talk about today. We are going to talk about platforms, and specifically, there's kind of 3 acts to this podcast today. One, we're going to try to do a little bit of a comparison around how to even define what a platform is and where platforms map over into platforms like Google or Amazon, and how much that applies to Ethereum, Solana, or Morpho, or Hyperliquid, or Uniswap, right? Like, where is the analogy real? Where does it break down? And how should we think about platforms and valuation, things like that in crypto? Next, we're going to talk about the different approach to growing and scaling platforms. So we're going to talk about, Myles, you've got a little 2x2 matrix I know you want to run by us here with product-led versus true developer platforms. And we're going to get into some examples of where that's worked in the past. And then finally, we're going to get deep in the weeds on crypto. And Xav, maybe we'll call in your expertise here. Talk about go to market, but then also we're going to analyze, the jobs that some of these, platform-ish companies have done in crypto historically. Okay, so to just start with a level set, and this is about as long as I can hear myself monologue here, so I'm going to ask you guys some questions in a second. But I just wanted to actually start with the definition of what a platform is. And I think this is one of the things, this is one of the, you would hear this and say, I know it when I see it. but actually there have been some really great, different tech moguls over the years have taken a whack at trying to create a litmus test for what a platform is. And the simplest definition that comes from Mark Andreessen is a platform is a system that can be programmed and therefore customized by outside developers. So the characteristics that you would look for is, frankly, a lot of the words that you've heard in crypto over the years. So extensibility, composability, two-sided network effects, non-linear value. So my Metcalfe's law, people are fist pumping, fist pumping at that. And then also increasing returns to scale. So the simple litmus test would be, if you were to remove all third-party developers or apps, does the thing still make sense? There have been a couple more specific definitions that maybe we can take a look at. I actually really like this quote from Jeff Bezos in particular here, which is, do your internal teams have to compete with external teams? Right? That's a really good one. And actually maybe an analogy there would be Meta in the past and what they did with Farmville. But do your internal teams have to compete with external teams? The other quote from Bill Gates is, do others make more than you? This is an ancient, Zave, I know you're Cosmos, and Myles too. I mean, like this was a huge debate in Cosmos at one point around economic security and should the apps make more than the platforms? And you start to see it in a lot of the dialogue here, but that's a really good one. Do others make more than you? And if you're a point of integration, then you're a platform. And then there's an interesting one here from this guy, Steve Yedge, which is a platform is a product that can be used by people who do not work for you without talking to you. So I thought those would be three really interesting kind of litmus tests that we can use to run through crypto platforms. And where I'll turn it over to you guys is, before we even get into what this has looked like historically, how platforms gone to market, and what does it look like in crypto today, I would love to just align, it's probably not possible on this podcast, but how cleanly does the way that we've thought about platforms in Web 2 map over to Web 3? And you see this all over in these debates between Hasib and Santiago about generating fees versus Metcalfe's law. And it feels like people are just talking past each other. So before we even get into the weeds of, mechanically how this works, do you think that these analogies map over cleanly from what a platform is in Web 2 into a Web 3 context? Maybe jumping off there.
Yeah, I can jump in. And I think maybe specifically the debate was like, are these tech platforms or are these monetary platforms, right? And, I'm head of product at Delta. We're building a new L1. I can tell you there's really no, like pragmatically, there's no way to build a monetary platform. Like, I'm not sure where that would really take us at this point. And that to me, I think in hindsight or like as an investor might make sense, but there's very little difference between like what Base enables as a platform and what Ethereum enables, right? Those are like basically clones of each other, except one is faster. So why is Ethereum a monetary platform when Base is clearly a developer platform? So I think just from like the perspective of folks that are trying to build these today, you should be paying attention to the I'd say like traditional technology platform playbooks of the past. And I think, yeah, we've been kind of speed running through a lot of history here and a lot of lessons learned. But yeah, I'll pause there. Zave, do you agree?
Yeah. I think, thanks for the intro, Mike. And I think the topic itself today is super interesting, I think, for all of us, because all of us are involved in different ways. I think Myles is actually working for a sort of platform himself right now and is very much in the mix with how to onboard developers, how to make it neutral, etc. Mike, of course, you're a distribution machine, so you're very much on the sort of product side. And myself, in the past, I've been very much heavily involved in infra, and these days a lot more focused on product and distribution. So it's maybe somewhere in the middle of you guys. I think right now, like my high level comment would be that there is certainly analogies to like the way that history has occurred in terms of what we can look at in crypto today. I think if we were to think about analogies here in terms of like Web 2, like AWS, of course, in the generic sort of platform space has done probably the best job on the internet. I guess where that sort of leaves me personally is just thinking like, there wasn't a massive amount of like winners in the generic infrastructure space, and even in Web 2. And I think like in crypto, Mike, you mentioned before that I was actively involved in the Cosmos ecosystem. Like the Cosmos vision was internet of blockchains, where you have like a bunch of blockchains, all different infrastructure, like layer ones everywhere. The problem with all the Cosmos chains was that like there simply wasn't enough apps building on top of the infrastructure. And I could make that argument for like so many different chains. And maybe there are apps sometimes, but the apps aren't differentiated. And there's like an oversupply of apps and an under demand of like people actually using the apps and like getting utility from the apps. So I kind of think right now where we are in crypto is like rethinking apps, I guess, and like demand for like what apps should even exist in the first place, and thinking very, very hard about that problem. And I think in general, if you manage to solve that problem, like I guess Hyperliquid did with the Perps exchange, you're in a very, very unique sort of place to build a platform on top of like the product itself. Like I think, Mike, you might have mentioned earlier, like maybe like someone like an Apple or like a Microsoft sort of did this as an analogy. And I think like that, I think is sort of a very interesting opportunity right now because it's such a hard problem to solve. But I think we were speaking, earlier that I think in general, it's very, very hard to do both right now. It's very hard to build generic platform, like extremely hard and getting harder over time. And also to build an app that has PMF, that has a lot of distribution and everyone using it and is super sticky, and then building a platform on top of that, I think is very hard. And I think Hyperliquid again here is probably the front runner, at least in my opinion, in terms of like building a great product that then turned into a platform. And one of the reasons why they did both well is because the product, again, solved a massive problem. But then the platform itself, the infrastructure and how much they optimize that, the Cosmos SDK and everything else, that's just like best in market by far. And I think like, again, they're leaders here because we've seen other players have apps trying to turn into platforms and maybe not going at the same rate that Hyperliquid is right now. So I think it's super interesting to see we're in the newer sort of era for like products turning into platforms, whereas like platforms that are generic, like an AWS and maybe like an Ethereum, that's is something that we've seen a lot in crypto in the past, and we can kind of see what works and what doesn't. So it's interesting sort of comparing and contrasting both those approaches.
This episode is sponsored by Katana. Katana is a DeFi first chain built for deep liquidity and real yield by redirecting chain revenue back to active DeFi users. The 1 billion KAT campaign is live. Bridge and deposit directly into vaults in one simple click and start earning immediately on your Ether, Bitcoin, USDC, and more. Follow the link in today's show notes to get started. As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk, terms, and conditions apply. Do your own research. I actually wanted to, because there is a difference here in between a product and a platform. And I think partially what makes this so confusing is everyone wants to say they're a platform because you get a higher multiple in valuation. So everyone's a platform. But again, I think it's helpful to actually run through the example of some of these as a litmus test, because especially the big tech giants like the hyperscalers and the Mag 7s of the world, it's quite interesting to apply this to. And Apple and the iOS platform is probably the best example of this, where it's absolutely a point of integration. You absolutely are, the apps are generating more than the underlying platform owner is. And also internally, you do sort of have to compete externally. There's a huge caveat with this that actually Apple applies extremely stringent requirements and frankly, a really fat take rate on their platform here. But by many standards of the definition, it absolutely is. There are other companies here. So this actually isn't listed on my list. Oh yeah, Facebook is a really good one. Facebook has probably the most interesting history of attempting to be a platform, but then eventually defaulting to a product. And you might look at Facebook or Meta and say, obviously this is a platform. Look at how large it is. Look at how many users it is. It's a marketplace that facilitates. And actually early on in Facebook, the Blue app's existence, there was a developer platform. And the idea was, and Myles is going to get into a little bit around product-led platforms. They led with a social graph, right? So they had this asset, which was the social graph. They were going to open that up to developers and try to create a real platform like Farmville. But then for many, many different reasons, that didn't end up working. A huge part of that was actually the shift from web, a browser where they thought they could build a platform, to mobile, like iOS and Android. And then Facebook couldn't take 30% if Apple was already taking 30%, right? So there are sometimes things that look like they can be true platforms, but then, when business forces intersect, you see who has the actual leverage. And it turns out that while it looked compelling there for a second, Facebook was going to start with this huge social graph, and you're like, wow, that's so valuable. eventually over time, they had to shelve that entire thing. They shut things like Farmville down overnight. People will remember. So I think that there are lots of, maybe to start to translate a little bit into crypto here now, and we're getting into, the app first or the product for led platform ecosystems versus true developer platforms. But I think we should run through, maybe towards the end of this podcast, the litmus test for protocols who are all trying to say that they are true platforms. But I think if you were to run through this test, I think many of them are most likely not. It would be my kind of contention going in here. So also, Myles, I'm going to turn it over to you. I want to get the 2x2 matrix here that you've come for this episode. But before we do, just like I guess commentary on how we're going to talk about this. I understand that it's an ongoing debate. Is Ethereum and Solana a monetary asset versus a tech platform? Open debate. I think the perspectives on this show would be probably it's more useful to just talk about them as if they are tech platforms, because Myles, to your point, there's nothing we can really do if this is a monetary asset other than say this is a monetary asset, right? So this is a little bit more aimed at practitioners, and I think it's probably just more useful is if we talk about them as more analogous to tech platforms.
Yeah,
right?
I agree. Like, and especially from my perspective, it's much easier and more pragmatic to do so. But it is kind of interesting. Like, if you were to try to what would you do to try to create like a monetary platform first, right? And it seems like proof of work is back in vogue, or at least folks are talking about that, right? And you could kind of argue that like if you try to do this fair, fair launch proof of work approach and just get this asset into as many hands as possible, and then just try to basically, meme your way into, getting developers because people are holding the asset and because you have attention, like it could work. Would I like put all my eggs in that basket as somebody who's like trying to build a platform? No, but I would call out like maybe Knockchain as a project that I've noticed recently that's trying to do that and as seems to be like getting some attention. So it's an interesting kind of thread to pull on. We've definitely thought about proof of work as well, but it's I think it's hard to square those two things or like know what to prioritize.
Well, can I but maybe skip ahead to one comparison here around Ethereum? And I know everyone's, Blockworks hates Ethereum. Do not at all. And actually, I will say, I personally, not speaking from Blockworks' perspective, have disagreed with a lot of the words that I hear coming out of some people from that ecosystem. But I think the strongest thing that you could say for why Ethereum is a platform is over the last 3 years, they have essentially tried to fire a huge portion of their users, right? They've said, don't transact on my layer, go up to L2s. They've also had clear product market fit with DeFi, and not only didn't try to foster that, but kind of actively tried to distance themselves at one point historically. And still, even with all of that, there's an enormous amount of traction and clear network effects that are accruing to ETH1. So to me, actually, if you look at the last 3 years, I don't agree with everything, but I think Ethereum is frankly the strongest case by far for a true platform in crypto. It's probably the only thing you could say that for, actually, at this point.
I think I agree with that. I think I would put Solana in there as well, but I think that's mainly because I actually would, Blockworks data might be able to tell us this, but I really do like the definition of, okay, it's like the GDP of what's happening on your platform, multiples of the amount of money you're making, or like, the cumulative revenue. And I do think that, for a time, Ethereum, I agree with you, but for a time, Ethereum was actually probably making more or like as much as all the apps on its platform. That was back when gas fees were really high. And I'd be curious to see, like, I would imagine today, Solana and Ethereum's like ratios are probably pretty similar. And both like very in the platform category of that definition, at least.
Myles, can I call on you? I want to understand, again, whether or not these things are monetary assets, or we're going to set that aside for a second. And I just want to talk about how Web2 platforms, how they've chosen to go to market and position themselves. And I think one distinction is leading with the platform versus a strong app and building a platform around it. And then another is, product led versus being true developer platforms where there's just no product on it whatsoever. So can you help expand on that?
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's two paths to becoming a successful platform, right? You can either build a product first, and that gets lots of users, and then users, basically, if you have users that developers want to reach, it's actually like this is to me like the clearest, like most obvious path to success. Now building a product that like can get that sort of success and leverage and positioning to be able to go like horizontal into a platform, that's difficult, right? um, or you can start with the just true developer platform approach. um, and within that, I think there are, basically, if you take the first approach, like the product that you build is your wedge. If you go as a true developer platform, you still need a differentiated wedge, right? um, and I think we've seen like market timing does make a big difference. Like if you are just building a platform and you're the first one of a new type of like compute paradigm or a new kind of apps, like I would argue, Ethereum was successful in being just a true developer platform without having to build, first party apps itself, just because it was the first to enable like a new category of applications, right? Like trustless, verifiable applications that can move money. And other, that's definitely not the case today in crypto. And then if you look at like other sort of platforms in Web 2, at least, AWS like is a great example of a massive business, a massive brand that commercializes its, infrastructure basically. And you could argue maybe Base is kind of the closest to this today, right? It's like, okay, well, we trust Coinbase. Coinbase is building this, platform. Okay, it's got a good name brand behind it, and hopefully they'll help me out with distribution, right? From their massive user base of centralized exchange customers. And then I think the harder but like more I would say like the more realistic path that you have to take as like a startup that's trying to build a true developer platform is this: you need some sort of like capability edge, right? You have to be like, and it has to start small and narrow and specific. It's like you need to be the easiest way to do this, right? Or you have to very clearly present to the market a problem that you uniquely solve, that is very top of mind for developers. And then you got to get like showcases out there of examples of how you solve this in like high leverage channels, right? I think that's kind of where most L1s are at today. But yeah, I guess I'll pause there. Like, does that sort of framework make sense to you guys? Or I know there's lots of nuances.
Yeah, I think both you guys have touched on some interesting points. The way that I've sort of thought about it, and so going back to your question a little while ago, Mike, regarding Ethereum as like a sort of king platform, I think Ethereum still is the king. I think none of us here know in 5 years' time, is it Ethereum or is it Solana or someone else? I do think that Ethereum and Solana both are like probably the biggest platforms in terms of just like mindshare. When I'm talking about Ethereum, I'm more talking about like EVM almost as a platform. I think
Sure.
Ethereum has encapsulated the EVM the best, and then Base is like lower fees, more users, but I think Ethereum still has the liquidity and TVL, etc. So it's interesting. I don't know if you made this point earlier, Mike, but Ethereum did go live as proof of work. Obviously Bitcoin money, Ethereum kind of has been pushed as money, and I do think, like at least in my experience and years in crypto, sometimes price does attract developers. And so thinking about Ethereum, so it started at the super low price. A bunch of people made money, a bunch of computer people, developers, and they're thinking, I paid all this money. I'm a programmer. Like, why don't I make an app for fun? Because I've already made all this money. And so mix that with the fact that Ethereum was the first chain to allow developers to program with money in the first place. So like they are solving a problem that's very obvious and needed by developers. And, that's already been proven today. My question after that is more like, you look at Solana again. We were very active in Solana when that was getting started back in the day. And Solana very clearly, like, not only was sort of price rising from the attention that it garnered from, whether it was FTX or just like completely different VM or like way of doing it. Realistically, the reason why I think Solana has done so well is because it kind of solved another problem that Ethereum didn't necessarily solve, which was that, we saw in the last 2021 cycle that Ethereum was very expensive during like times of higher network activity, and layer twos were sort of coming, but not really there yet. And Solana managed to find a way to create a chain that was easy for developers to sort of use, because a lot of developers are already familiar with Rust. And that was the first sort of approach that really targeted Rust as a language that developers, especially good developers, had a lot of familiarity with. And so that was one thing which they felt very familiar with the technology already. Plus, it was cheap. Then users would use the apps, and sort of this flywheel was created. And so why I'm bringing all this up is because like I do think that Solana mixed both the kind of price and the attention and like all the liquidity, etc., with the fact that it actually solved a real problem of like the platform of Ethereum itself, and continues to do so today. But for what it's worth, I also think that Ethereum is not going away, and I actually see both those chains as being used for different purposes long term. Although it is interesting to think about the fact that Ethereum did start as proof of work and still has a high valuation and valuation frameworks for that, etc., and it's now proof of stake. But yeah, I think in general, like when it comes to platforms, these two come to mind as like real kingmakers. I guess I don't know how you guys see it, but like Base. And then on the flip side, I think it's also worth mentioning that what you're seeing now outside of EVM and Solana is like a lot of ones that have gone live in the last 4 or 5 years are kind of struggling a lot actually right now. And like I think it's really, really difficult right now to create another platform, because I think Myles, you mentioned it before, of like this problem is a bit more niche. And so then the question is like the demand from developers, and of course, like I'm actually curious to hear your take from Delta as well here, Myles, and the problem that you guys solve. But it's kind of like the demand from developers has, in my opinion, been somewhat already like supplied in terms of like chains that exist. So then the question is like the strongest developers today in crypto, like where are they going? Like I think most of them probably go into Ethereum and Solana because they either know Rust or they're already an Ethereum person. And I think it's incredibly hard. I mean, I'm curious to hear from you, Myles, but like Solana itself, like my question would be as a developer right now in terms of like a generic platform, like is there something that you think that these generic platforms today aren't really serving, like an Ethereum or Solana, in terms of like speed or cost or like familiarity with the developer language? And like, do you think there still is a gap for a more generic platform to take its place?
Yeah. So I think short answer is like no. Like you have to be something very, very different today. And I think in my role, I'm constantly trying to like square and balance let's say like the playbooks and lessons learned from the history of the internet and the playbooks and lessons, or like, maybe not written in stone, but written in pencil, of like what's worked in crypto specifically for the past 5 years. Right. And it felt like there was a time in crypto where like there was a playbook for new L1s that was kind of working, like kind of. But the playbook has had like increasingly diminishing returns. And so, it was, let's say like after maybe Ethereum and Solana had like, maybe when Solana was like just taking off, this is probably at its peak. And it follows like this hot ball of money sort of, behavior from investors as well. But if you were like the next well-funded hot L1, your launch was seen, at least within like the crypto developer community, as like a land grab opportunity, right? To go fill out all like the foundational DeFi, things that have worked in other ecosystems. And you would, okay, cool. Like you would go grab like a DEX and, a lending protocol. Like I think maybe AVAX C chain is a good example of this, where like all of a sudden it was like, oh, we got Trader Joe. That's a sushi swap, like fork, and XYZ, right? And the more and more of these L1s that came out, like one, the more saturated like the developer, market was, and two, like the less attractive it became to developers, like this land grab, like sort of opportunity became, right? And so you would just get apps that were like less and less differentiated. And they would put, these developers, like you could incentivize them with all like the developer incentives and grants in the world, right? But like it just, the adverse selection kept getting, stronger and stronger and stronger. You'd get devs that would be putting in like very little effort to go throw out a smart contract, app that was basically a fork of something that existed. You'd give them a grant, and then they would probably like move on to the next ecosystem, in a year or two later. And so that's kind of where I feel like we're at right now is, okay, everybody's looking at this, playbook that was, and being like, very clearly, this is not working anymore. Right. And we've got like pretty famous, flops that we've seen over the past like 2 years just to sort of back that up. Right. And so I think we're kind of back to this, like, chicken and the egg problem for platforms, which is pretty clearly that, to get users, you need apps, but to get developers for those apps, you need users that those developers actually want to reach, right? And so, even I just, the cold start problem and starting with the developer side has is really hard. Like, it's rarely been successful, and even Windows like failed at this miserably when they were in its early stages. Like, they felt like they only had influence really to exert on the developer side, that they didn't have like a strong user, like a strong ownership of like the end customer. And so they actually like paid out big cash incentives to developers to build apps on Windows, and it didn't go well. Like, the really strong builders said, okay, I'm not going to come like build an app for like an empty graveyard of like a platform, right, with no users. Like, it will cost me more to maintain the app than I will be getting in revenue. And then other other developers that were like, less strong, or like put in a little effort. It kind of reminded me of like the later stages of this L1 playbook before it died. And it just became very, very clear that like it is not a chicken and the egg problem, at least for consumer app platforms. Like, first come users. Once there are users, there will become demand for application, and like, this is the by far and away the strongest and only incentive out there. So, and to your point, Mike, like, look at Apple. I mean, their like app store policies to developers is egregious. Like, they take a 30% take. There is a term called Sherlocking that was created because Apple, there was some app a long time ago called Sherlock, and Apple just cannibalize that by putting out a first party app. And now every year TechCrunch comes out with like, what did Apple Sherlock this year? And to be fair, they're not usually trying to Sherlock like huge apps, apart from, I would say, like Apple Music versus Spotify. Like, that was going after one of the biggest apps on the App Store. But it just gives you a sense of just how much leverage you can have as a platform, and how like well positioned you are if you own the user relationship already with a killer product. And so when it comes to the consumer space, platforms are typically symptoms of products that moved the needle for the market. And the only way to be a platform company is to be a product company first, acquire users, then incentivize developers. And so that's kind of where I think we're at. And I'd pose it to you guys, like, is there any choice these days as an L1 of what to do?
I think that's what I want to underline here and get at is, so I want to, because so oftentimes in crypto, people moralize and say things like, you are a great example that actually I think is the setup and mission of the Ethereum Foundation versus the Solana Foundation. And what the criticism of the Solana Foundation is, look, they're so active. They're doing things like building a phone that's immoral or centralizing. And to me, that's the result of business strategy necessity, because they didn't have the option of doing what Ethereum did when they launched, of just being this open developer neutral platform. And they had to do things like the Break Solana app or Serum. They maybe they didn't want to do these things. I doubt they really did. Who wants to take on extra work? But they said, hey, we can't be this totally lead with this blank slate like Ethereum did. We have to suggest this to the market. And I think that since you've seen that, and again, to give like really famous examples of like starting with a wedge or product and building a platform around it, the Office suite from Microsoft is probably the best example, where they just built this unbelievably sticky product and wrapped a ton of stuff around it, versus something like Linux, where you start from totally blank slate. Right? Those are very, very different approaches. And first of all, both are totally fine and acceptable strategies. Like, there's no reason to put moralizing around this. However, I do think within crypto, Myles, to answer your question, I think that the market does force your hand as a developer platform in terms of what will work. I think the huge, people talk about the immaculate conception of Bitcoin. I think Ethereum has an exorbitant advantage of being able to be neutral from day one. And that was their strategy that worked at the time. I don't think anyone since Ethereum has truly had that privilege of being completely neutral in a developer platform. And I think over time, what you've seen is evolving towards what you're describing, which is more product led and more strategically differentiated, right? Opinionated versus unopinionated. And how I would take everyone on a journey here is Ethereum, completely blank slate developer platform. The Ethereum Foundation just sets up to maintain that structural advantage, that wedge that they had. Great. That's an advantage no one else has. Solana needed to be more active in their, they built Serum, or they, supported Serum, etc. They're much more supportive to specific apps, but my sense is the Solana Foundation prefers not to kingmake. They also try to do things like the phone, the Solana, the Saga, right? Like these are attempts to lead with product. And then you have something like Hyperliquid, which is the next evolution, which is far more opinionated, far more, first of all, not only around the organization, which is a relatively small team, but this is what our block space should be used for. And is it totally open? I mean, you saw the RFP, the stablecoin RFP was a pretty interesting example of this, where, okay, maybe the team had some influence behind the scenes. I don't know. But it certainly wasn't just, hey, you can technically build however you want, but like fully in practice, right? It was not that Yegi definition of you don't have to talk to your customers. Like that doesn't feel like the case. Now, I can hear the Hyperliquid stand saying HIP-3, all of this stuff. That might change in the future. But to me, the direction of travel here is getting far more opinionated. And I don't think that's because of some moral thing. I think it's just you got to play the game on the field. And that's the game on the field today. And yeah, that's what I would.
Yeah, I kind of want to double click into the Solana piece, because to me, this is like the playbook that I look at as been the most successful in being a true developer platform within that's active, right? And is somewhat reflective of what could be successful, moving forward. Like Break Solana. I don't know if you guys remember that app. It was an app where you just slam the keyboard as fast as possible. Every time you touch the keyboard, it made a transaction on Solana. And at the time, I mean, I think we were paying like $50 per transaction in gas on Ethereum. That was the number one problem that was top of mind for every single user and developer. And it was what was stopping, these applications from being actually really useful and consumer friendly on like a day-to-day basis, right? We were getting priced out of Ethereum. And then you look at Serum, and you go, okay, they clearly want to attack DeFi. Their marketing tagline was NASDAQ on chain, right? And because they solved this problem, you could put an order book on chain. That, like, the point of Serum was not like Hyperliquid, I don't think, where they wanted it to be the canonical like exchange of Solana, or they kind of viewed it as, well, if it does become that, great. If it doesn't, that's fine too, because it inspired basically a whole like class of DeFi builders to understand what's possible and what they can build on Solana. And then the phone, I think, is also like, yeah, it failed, but it was, I think, like spirit, like in spirit, in the right direction, where they're trying to basically accelerate distribution of these apps. They say, okay, the thesis is that like mobile is the future for all of crypto. Current mobile like phones or app, iOS and Android, they don't actually support crypto apps very well, right? There's nothing built into the hardware that allows them to do that. We can create a best-in-class like product experience for these apps if we build a phone ourselves, and we can, get that into more hands. It didn't work out, but I do think that like these are the sort of things that, if you're not going to if you don't have the DNA in your team to like build one specific app, like these are the sort of things you have to do.
Shout out to today's sponsor, Katana. Katana is a DeFi first chain built for deep liquidity and high yield. No empty emissions, just real yield and sequencer fees routed back to DeFi users. Incubated by Polygon Labs and GSR, Katana is launching with notable ecosystem of primitives, assets, and partners like Morpho, Chainlink, and more. Katana's 1 billion KAT campaign is live. Bridge and deposit directly into Vault in one simple click and start earning immediately on your Ether, Bitcoin, USDC, and more. Follow the link in today's show notes to get started. As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk, terms, and conditions apply. Do your own research. On go to market here, one thing that we can start to do is pull in specific examples here. And I know we've been talking about Ethereum, Solana, and Hyperliquid, but there's lots of other examples from maybe let's focus on kind of the gen purpose L1, L2, ostensibly trying to be a developer platform and how that's evolved. Let's just talk about the current state of play and what the strategy has been for Monad and Mega ETH and actually Berachain, which I know people have strong opinions on, but I think their innovation was they did lead with a bunch of first party applications, and people didn't call it that, but they had a homegrown borrow lend, homegrown borrow, because outside of like the control and the economics, there is a UX experience of you don't want people to go bridge over to your chain and have there be nothing to do or missing core infrastructure. There's also been there have been discussions around this on the Ethereum side of things. If people remember the Lido and the Eigenlayer, I mean, how hilarious are those debates in hindsight, right? But they were going to take over Ethereum, and there was, I frankly think that was, way overblown. But I do think there was a shred of real, genuine truth of maybe this is really core infrastructure. Do we want someone external to, having maybe misaligned incentives there to be running something like this? So I think maybe we can also start to focus in on the more targeted and opinionated approach of someone like a Mega ETH, for instance, who takes another big question around platforms in general are being totally neutral versus king making. And king making has this really negative connotation, but again, to take the moral element out of it, I think it all comes from business necessity, which is we don't have thousands of people trying to build. We have a more limited number, and we want to support who we view as being the best teams. If you only have 10 good teams and 200 really crappy teams, I think it's a super viable strategy to pour more support behind your 10 good teams because you're trying to maximize the chance of success here. So can we talk about a little bit of the evolution of go-to-market and distribution and maybe start talking about some of these specific gen purpose sort of chains, and then we can get into finally some of the app layer examples. I'm really curious to get your guys' perspective on the Morphos and Uniswaps of the world, whether or not we should view them as a platform or not.
Yeah, and I think just maybe to start in terms of like starting with maybe Solana and Ethereum before moving on. So in terms of the foundations and the sort of bottom up versus top down approach and king making apps, like you mentioned, Mega ETH as well. So interestingly enough, as Myles was saying before, so Solana, it did start like very top down, and Ethereum sort of more bottoms up as well. But what's ended up happening probably in the last 6 months, I think we've seen this, like Ethereum Foundation is for the first time taking a much more top down approach on the business side. And I'm like super bullish on this. I'm actually working relatively closely with that business team at Ethereum Foundation, and they're sort of catching up a bit because I think they realized that Solana did such a good job at this. Of like Solana was so appealing. Like probably if I was a developer to some extent, I would have built on Solana in the last 2 or 3 years because like the support they give you, they're all around you. They're like connecting you with everyone in the ecosystem. Ethereum didn't have that. Cosmos didn't have that back in the day for what it's worth. And so like in terms of top down versus bottom up and foundations, etc., I think one of the reasons why it's so hard, even today, Ethereum started bottoms up, but it's more top down again. It's because like bottoms up is very decentralized. It's in like the ethos of crypto, which I think all of us are in it, for that reason. But at the end of the day, so many foundations and also many decentralized organizations, including DAOs, for what it's worth, like they've somewhat failed at coordinating. Okay, so like you mentioned before, like you might want to have 5 or 10 apps and like sort of pour resources into those strategically. That makes sense because that's like a good business decision. If you have too many people talking at the table, people get confused, like they sort of lose focus. Things don't get done, and the execution is actually terrible. And to some extent, one might make the argument maybe in the last 4 or 5 years on Ethereum, even though it started bottoms up, incredibly neutral, like it lost a bit of focus, and we all saw that. And I think since they've been a bit more centralized and top down, like I feel like there's this new energy in the Ethereum ecosystem. Vice versa in Solana, like they're top down, and I think they always get the priorities right. And it's kind of like grass is always green. It's just to some extent, like probably they're looking at the DeFi ecosystem on Ethereum being like, oh, like this is such a great ecosystem, how they get TVL, liquidity, etc. Stuff that Ethereum's already done. So in terms of the newer age chains, like you're asking before, Mike, like you have like a Monad and a Mega ETH and everything else and Berachain, etc. So Monad, I would maybe make the argument in terms of the earlier definition of like what is a platform and like how do you be as hands off as possible when everyone builds on top. I might even make the argument without a whole lot to back it up, but like I haven't seen any chains in the last like 2 or 3 years launch where like I come out and say I'm launching a chain and you come to me and you come build on my platform. Like unless I'm paying you or like something's involved with like a cohort where you're being selected, like I don't think you can actually create a platform that's like in the definition of a true platform that we're talking about at the very earliest stages in terms of like no support is given whatsoever, people just building on top. Maybe that will happen in future, like who knows? Like someone might come up with an idea to actually solve that. In the meantime, because we know that that hasn't worked in the past, people are going further and further towards a centralized approach, e.g. Hyperliquid. I think the best example here again. Mega ETH is very similar. Like I think I don't really have an opinion on Mega ETH and like what's going to happen in the ecosystem. I think they've done a really great job at finding high quality entrepreneurs. Like it's as simple as that. Like the idea could be anything. Like shout out to I'm forgetting the name right now, but the tap to like the options thing. I forgot what that's called. When you guys can jump in here. Too many names of projects. Myles, you know?
I know exactly what you're talking about. I also
You're for it. So,
there you go.
Great
Yeah.
founder, like cool product, like it's something new and it's actually consumer facing. I might also make the argument here that like Mega ETH would be interesting if there is a breakout app like a Euphoria, which I think is super cool. There comes a stage when you have all these users and attention where it's like I might be a little bit too bearish on infrastructure here, but like I kind of think it's so easy to create an EVM chain to some extent now, where you can sort of, if you have distribution and adoption, like what's stopping you moving off Mega ETH? And we've seen kind of this happen a bit. Maybe we don't really know the inner workings of Mega ETH, but some teams have kind of come in, they've been selected and they've sort of gone out. You know, maybe there's other people throwing money at these people. Like if you're an app developer in crypto right now, building something super cool, you're in very high demand. People are going to pay you a lot. And so like, then it comes down to a game of incentives as a platform. So then like Monads raise like how many hundreds of millions. They're the best example right now, probably a platform that has a lot of newer apps going live because they have so much money. They can probably throw these incentives at these developers. Mega ETH raised a lot as well, but they've gone a bit more top down. Verachain also raised a lot, but maybe like where potentially they didn't go as well was just in terms of like kind of things that hadn't been done before. And I think really Mega ETH, from what I understand, is like they're really trying to push this angle of like kind of new apps that haven't been done before, like reworking what you can do with EVM super fast, a bit like the Solana pitch back in the day. I might also throw a sort of spanner in the works here as well in terms of like going against the grain. So what I'm actually observing right now personally is actually the opposite. And so like you're seeing, okay, we've talked about platforms so far on this podcast, and we've also talked about products maybe turning into platforms a little bit. What I'm actually seeing as a reverse is also true. So like a lot of platforms or like infrastructure, let's say, that I've actually invested in maybe in the last few years, I think a lot of infrastructure has failed in crypto, like generic infrastructure in the last year or two. And I think like most people will understand that. What has been interesting is like the teams that have managed to evolve and pivot into like turning that infrastructure and platform into a product that then serves a market, which I find like very, very interesting. So they're actually going from platform to product, which I think is actually very, very tough. And potentially zero examples exist of this in crypto right now, where there's been infrastructure, which has been generic. I had this like high IQ thesis of some execution layer going live that was going to completely disrupt crypto. Turns out like that didn't happen, but now that execution layer, they're sort of productizing that and trying to serve the enterprise market actually, which again is a completely separate topic, which maybe we can talk about in another podcast. But what I'm saying here is that like I think in real time right now you're seeing in crypto like many different approaches. You can plug up, like pull apart all of them, and every single approach is different right now of like different teams going live, especially when it comes to infrastructure, including Delta. And I actually, Myles, I'd love to hear like your approach versus Mega ETH, etc. in a second. But like I think right now like jury is out in terms of like I don't think you can be a like just a neutral platform when people come to you anymore. I think incentives do matter. But then at the same time, I think that the application developer themselves, the product themselves, they have the power now of like, even if they get a bit of distribution through your platform, if they end up taking some users and the product is good enough, I wonder if they just then go out to build their own product and then platform that on top, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting time in crypto and it's like a very timely topic. So yeah, Myles, I'd love to hear like Delta, like how you see it.
Yeah, totally. And maybe I'll just like reference like Eigenlayer, right? They put out a very sort of generic infrastructure platform that it, does like open up a new design space for verifiable types of services, right? And there was a lot of hype in the beginning, and I think the lesson learned there was that basically they had to be more opinionated. That AVSs were not, developers were not just going to figure out like what the killer AVSs are to build, right? They had to basically say, okay, no, we're going to build a B2B product, right? We're not going to build a consumer app necessarily ourselves. We're going to build a B2B product that's targeting a specific vertical, right? In AI, like verifiable AI. That's like sort of the end goal that we see, and we need to like basically pull that in to today and give, you know, a very like targeted specific tool to do that, right? And then I think there's for, if you know, platforms that are trying to get application developers, you know, I would say like from my seat at Delta, we're kind of doing both, right? We've incubated 2 B2B products because we were going out to all these existing companies and like post PMF existing companies or fintech startups, basically outside of crypto. Like, okay, here's this, you know, the Delta domain SDK. Like, there's so many things you can do with it. And they're like, we're not going to like just go figure this out ourselves, right? You have to like figure out what you can build with this, what problems you can solve, right? And then we incubated 2 companies that can go themselves to those existing companies outside of crypto with a very narrow solution that is leveraging, you know, a Delta domain, absolutely. But it's not just this like open source general purpose SDK that you're just going to have to figure out what to do with, right? And then on the consumer side, we've also, you know, incubated applications that we think are super differentiated and highlight things that only can be built on Delta. And I think that's the only way to do it, right? Like I get asked all the time, like, are you guys EVM compatible? Like, we can be, but I don't really want to get into that game because it's kind of a big grants and incentives game going after the same, like, you know, handful of maybe 25 to 50 at any given time, like, you know, free agent, high quality builders, right? And it's like, it's so much adverse selection. You're just going to end up paying so much money, right, to get these guys. And you don't, I think that's not like the most organic, you know, way to develop an ecosystem. That's not going to inspire the next generation, right, of application developers that you shouldn't have to give grants to if you're successful, right? If you're just putting out clones. So if you're not doing something that enables like applications that can't be built anywhere else, it's really tough out there. And I think, you know, Mega ETH is like, sure, it is an EVM. Yes, it goes faster than any EVM before. And that's like, I think has given them enough to go find applications that really couldn't exist elsewhere. I don't know for sure, but that's my sense.
I have a thought here, and I want to eventually transition us to maybe some of the stuff that we've thought about being more in the app layer, but lives in between what could be potentially a platform and an application with a product. But I also want to ask you guys about focus and the downside of and how difficult it is to either transition from a platform and infrastructure play to a product, or what you often see is, hey, we need to build a product so that we can dog food our own infrastructure. I will just say from a focus standpoint, that there's a drawback to that for sure. And as someone who is a founder of a company that started as a media company and, you know, now has, you know, 30% of our revenue coming from, you know, recurring data, that type of thing, it is really difficult to do. You know, from an operational standpoint, I mean, just repeating to everyone, this is where we're going, this is how it's changing, talking to like having kind of 2 different parallel orgs run. I mean, there's a real complexity and drawback and cost and speed impact there. And I'm curious from both Myles, from your seat at Delta, but also Xavier, maybe more from the investing side of things. How are you advising here? I sometimes you just got to do what you got to do, but I also see from maybe personal experience here, it's tough, right? It's not like you don't just wave a wand and say, hey, we were infra, we should be in product. Boom. You know?
Yeah, I just think right now in crypto, like thinking long and hard about demand is like so important.
Yeah.
And so like taking you back to the example I gave before of this porco that was like building sort of literally a platform, and they had a competitor pop up doing a very similar technology, let's say. And the competitor, they were trying to be a platform for third-party developers to build on top of. And they popped up maybe a year after this company had already started. And the company learned after 6 to 12 months that like there just wasn't enough demand from developers to like kind of build on top of the initial platform. but there was a market for what that platform enabled in the first place, if that makes sense. And so to like dumb it down a bit, so what it does enable is like sort of like it's a browser node where it sort of looks at what's happening in your browser and collects data. Let's say if you're prompting an LLM or something like that, and this data is like very valuable for anyone to understand how you're prompting something before you make a purchasing decision. You can imagine many companies want that as a product, but they kind of made the decision to target companies that would want this data over developers almost. And so now I think there's an open question right now in this overall of like in crypto, do you target the developers, or maybe you already have so much insight into how your platform or infrastructure can be used that you just end up building the product yourself almost, and then you kind of productize the infrastructure, which is a completely separate thing to what we've been talking about before. So I think a lot of it comes down to like how flexible you are, and then when you find any PMF whatsoever, going back to Mike's point, like you then have to double down and focus and like get all hands on deck for like selling that. And this is actually a big point in general when it comes to platforms as well, as someone that's worked with quite a few in the past at Chorus One as well. Like BD is like an art in crypto, and I've worked in BD, selling infrastructure, etc. And it's super hard. And like Myles, of course, is doing this right now as like BD at Delta, because like you're kind of trying to get people on board onto what you're doing. But then I know Delta is different, but let's say it's like Monad versus Mega ETH. You're basically pitching the same thing, like come to my fast chain. Then it's all about like relationships, and it's very hard to like sell and on board. And so I think like coming back to the demand point, if you have a good product that sells itself, like that is ultimately kind of a great end state to be in, because then the BD spend less time trying to onboard developers, and it just solves a clear problem. People can easily use it. And that's why I'm also kind of bullish right now on like where we're at in crypto in terms of like products, because like if you think about where we are right now, like we've got all this infrastructure built already, like platforms, let's call it. We got the layer one platforms. What we also have at the same time is like the kind of middleware layer of like we have like whatever ZK this, TLS this, like a lot of data stuff like Chainlink, oracles, like whatever data you want, like we can get that on chain like pretty easily now. So the question is like now you have all this at your disposal, like can you come up with an idea that's interesting enough that you think has demand from some market inevitability to actually build? And that is actually complex. And I think right now like there's only very few teams in crypto that can actually leverage all these platforms and middleware and actually build a great application or product. And that's where I think a lot of the opportunity is actually right now, because like there is a lot of things that we can build. And I also want to make another example here, which maybe is more to your earlier point, Mike, of like these apps that are the apps really platforms. Like Polymarket for me is like an app, but it's actually somewhat becoming a platform in real time right now. There's sort of like Polymarket cohorts. There are people building on top of Polymarket right now, et cetera, et cetera. So like what's really interesting there, and I had a conversation earlier today, is like think about, I don't know if you'd consider like UMA a platform, like the Oracle, but like UMA maybe more like middleware than a platform. But in any case, like the amount of value that UMA accrues from the success of Polymarket is like insignificant compared to like the value that Polymarket as an application accrues to itself. And then now it's building a platform on top of that. So all this is to say, I think like just because of the power and how hard it is right now to build a great product with like what's there and find demand for something that actually people want to use, like I think that is like really interesting to explore further. Maybe another podcast we can think about like actual ideas for applications people could build that haven't been experimented with that much so far. But like yeah, I think in general trying to find PMF and demand and then focusing on that and putting everything there and being less opinionated. Actually, I think teams that are less opinionated on where the end state are going to do better, because crypto's evolving very fast right now. And then try and experiment with, especially with a product's hat on, like test with users first and get user feedback before you build it, like save resources and then focus on building the product when you already know there's demand for it. So focus is obviously critical. Mike at Blockworks, I know like you've had some different things you've explored in the past. At Chorus One, we also explore different things. And then we always just realized that staking was a core competency of Chorus One, and that's what we did best. And like, so I think there's always things you could be doing, but as soon as you have something really good, you just want to hang on to that. And I think that is important. And I think if teams experiment like Delta, maybe they incubate an app, or maybe they have like a platform or something like that, but then maybe they incubate an app that does really well. I'm talking like this is a sick app. Like maybe the attention then is diverted to just that application becoming the biggest thing that Delta has. And that could also be a huge market in itself. So those are just some high level thoughts I would say on the topic.
I also want to introduce this idea of and this is maybe taking us out of the weeds, but actually is a bit of a bull case for the existing. I mean, if I were to sum up the last 20 minutes of our conversation, is it's really hard if you are trying to build something that looks like a platform today. And I think that it's funny that, I mean, I probably do over index a little bit on you can counter trade sentiment in crypto, but I kind of think you can for the most part. And I do when it comes to something like Ethereum or Solana, especially with Ethereum, the time to be bearish was 3 years ago. And everything that we have said about being forced into a specific positioning and go to market to me says the barriers to entry are higher than they've ever been. And it's harder to compete than it's ever been. So
Yep.
that's a huge, I think that's a really important observation to take away. Whether or not you want to value these couple chains as a monetary asset or as a platform, even if you were to say these are a platform, I think looking at the competitive landscape going out, it looks pretty good. It's more difficult to compete than it's been. I wouldn't want to compete against Delta, but that's, that's
No, I mean, I think like, yeah, if you're building a platform today, you have really no choice other than to build a consumer app, to build a developer like facing like a more specific developer facing app on your platform that you can then go sell, or do some combination of both. I do think that there is more inherent tension that arises later if you go with a canonical consumer app, right, and then try to expand into a platform out of that. I don't think it's been done successfully yet in crypto. Like, I think I would consider Uniswap's V4 like not super successful, and I think that was also like, there's a lot of reasons for that. We'll see with Hyperliquid in general. Yeah, go for it, Mike.
Can we get into this? We've got 10 minutes left. I want to go through a lightning round of what you guys. So I did some work with ChatGPT, my thought partner here, and I was using these litmus tests that we've reviewed as, or that we kind of started this episode with, as within crypto, what do you think qualifies as a true platform here? And the examples we've got are Solana, Ethereum, Solana, Base, Hyperliquid, Uniswap, Morpho, Aave, Compound, Maker, USDC/Circle, Tether, Curve. I'm going to ask you each. Myles, can you run down this? I'm curious. Just do a quick lightning round. Yes,
Yeah,
no.
sure.
Yeah.
Yes. So like Ethereum, yes. Solana, yes. Hyperliquid, put them right in the middle. Uniswap, no. Morpho, no, not yet. Aave, no, not yet. Compound, they still around. And Maker, no.
Tough for my Compound stance out
Yeah,
there.
Circle and Tether. I guess you could argue they've expanded. You could argue that the stablecoin was a product. They are now launching platforms off of that product, like Hyperliquid. I think they're coming at it from a much tougher spot than Hyperliquid was, like in expanding to that. The general purpose like EVM. But like Plasma and Arc, are very clear like attempts at platform plays that I think are less of a slam dunk, but they've got, probably a lot of money. So Curve, Convex, no.
All right, Xav, same exercise. What do you think?
For me, Ethereum, yes, is a platform. Solana, yes, is a platform. Base, yes, is a platform. Hyperliquid, yes, is a platform in a more limited way. Uniswap is even more of a limited way than Hyperliquid, but I would actually maybe argue is a platform. Morpho is like maybe somewhat. Aave, I was actually going to mention this before, so I'm happy it's in this table. What I'm finding interesting about Aave, and I think that they're going to be the start of many, many more to come, is that Aave was like a protocol, and instead of like building a chain, they're actually building a more like kind of fintechy app, like an end user facing app. And I think they're doing that because they see that there's more value that's going to accrue there. So I would say Aave is not a platform, but they're seeing more value at the sort of fintechy app layer. And so that's a very interesting approach by them, which is cool. Compound, good question. Maker, I guess depends because they kind of change to different entities, so that's a tough one. And then again, I agree with Myles, where like obviously Circle and Arc and Plasma, etc. I think another good example, which we didn't talk about in this podcast though, is actually Tempo. Like Tempo is platform for me. And like they're probably one of the best platforms in Web 2. If you want to draw any analogy, is like what a sick platform they've got. And I think that they're going to be a force to be reckoned with when it comes to platforms. And it might teach everyone Web 3 a bit of a lesson about how to build a platform. Like they've got some great talent there right now. They've got some cool people building very differentiated apps. So, and I'm not sponsored by Tempo or anything like that. So it'll be interesting. Like that's going to be the first thing we see in crypto, I think, where Web 2 comes to Web 3, and maybe who knows if Google and maybe Amazon builds a chain and see if how they go to platform in crypto. So
yeah, I'm super interested to see what Tempo decide, how they want to position themselves and how focused they are on payments. Stripe is like the platform for platform. You can see how they would just like flip a switch, and anybody who has business has like a link account now, some of that's running on Tempo, right? But are they actually going to like fully try to compete with general purpose platforms, including Ethereum? Do you see like a roll up centric roadmap there? Like they have all the folks that like could build roadmap. Like I don't know.
Lives, good lord.
But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there are roll ups on Tempo. That's what I would say.
Okay, let me call attention to a couple of things. Myles, I'll take the other side of that. So ChatGPT, the only true platform it said actually was Ethereum. Solana being almost, I don't know why it's knocking it here, product first before becoming a real platform. But yeah, I guess the knock against Base is that it's so heavily shaped by Coinbase. There was a really interesting discussion we don't need to go into. Is Google a platform leading with search as the key product, and then you can use, but it's so heavily influenced and curated. There probably is a bit of a distinction there around the amount of control that gets exercised.
It's an aggregator.
Basically, everything else is transitioning to partial, Uniswap, Morpho, Aave, Compound, and then just USDC, Tether, Curve, Convex, or Nose. I had something that I wanted to, maybe an additional litmus test that Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos did not talk about. Maybe this will be the Ippolito platform litmus test, but what happens if you get rugged? And I thought was a really interesting, because Myles, you and I have talked about this a ton in the past around, hey, like if leverage is truly moving to the apps, then when are we going to commoditize these pesky base layers? And that just has not happened. And I'm going to show you this chart of Aave here, which is deployed on, I think, like 20 some chains. And still to this day, 80% of their revenue comes from Ethereum. And, I think through in my head, like there are some other, again, towards the stickiness and the value accrual, I think people might be wrong. I think we've over rotated, right? Like we went from fat protocols thesis where all the value is going to accrue to these fatty protocols. And now it's all up to the application. And oh no, look at these fees. And I think a hypothetical to walk through would be, how easy would it be for Aave or Morpho or Uniswap to move off their main chain, ETH main chain? And I think the answer is really difficult. I don't think it would be easy almost at all. And there have been Uniswap is super interesting, right? You might have looked at it and said, look at all this liquidity on main chain. Of course, they're going to go to a cheaper chain, but then they tried with a bunch of stuff, UniV4, Unichain, haven't been super successful at migrating that. And I have a feeling if Aave or Morpho were to move, right? Because it might be tempting to say it doesn't matter the chain that it's on. It's the app. People have the relationship with Morpho or eventually the curators. Yeah, but in practice, I have a really hard time seeing Morpho ever fully move off of Ethereum. And so when I play through this in my head, and I think it's really interesting, Xavier, to hear you describe Aave viewing themselves more as an app and a managed product. But yeah, I think that, again, maybe the analog here, and I know Kyle Samani just sat up a little bit straighter there, is I think that there are some things, and by the way, there's no way that I can know, I'm just speculating and talking out loud here, but I think a really relevant historical example here is Facebook, where Facebook looked, and I think everyone would have said, wow, look at the social graph. I mean, eventually billions of users, 2/3 of the world is going to be, look at the leverage they have. Well, when there was a shift in the tech platform, you saw where the leverage really resided, which was on the mobile platforms, iOS and Android. And I think that it's very important to understand. I think one interesting heuristic here is you can play these what ifs in your head. How likely is it for applications to move off their main chain? Have they been successful? Has anyone been able to migrate their users? I mean, Ethereum has DeFi, right? That was the initial use case, and that's where it still got product market fit. Solana is kind of the exchange chain. I can't even think of a single example where a use case started on one chain and then migrated to another, even if it was far more optimized for that. I can't think of a single example. So I don't know. This wasn't really the point and conclusion here.
Besides for Tempo?
I don't think Tempo's going to. Sorry. I think that Tempo is going to run into some challenges because this is where I do think the neutrality is important here. And I love Stripe. I listened to that podcast. What's its face? The one with they're drinking beers and Cheeky Pint. And I like Cheeky Pint. And I like Paradigm a lot. I think they're brilliant. I think they're going to have a brand perception. And yeah, I mean, maybe, you know what, we could even do another podcast here on enterprise chains and where you see them playing out, winning and losing. I think that'd be a fascinating thing to get into. But Visa was a pretty great historical analog here of something that started out from a bank and then it got spun out because, hey, if there's going to be this network of payment aggregators, it needs to be neutral. Yep. We're just not going to go. And another example of this was maybe the Polygon Ag layer. If people are, that's, I think, still kind of alive and kicking, and brilliant idea for all intent. I'm not a ZK guy, but from everything I've heard, it's amazing tech. But the brand issue is it doesn't come across as neutral, even if they would treat it that way. So I personally, on the Tempo front, they're going to have a brand issue that I think is going to be really challenging.
I'm going to take the other side of that one too. I got roll-ups and no brand issue. And honestly, with the ag layer thing, I've noticed this too, solving the interop versus sovereignty trade-off, that's not a wedge. That's a multiplayer later stage sort of, nice property to have. But I think that also has to do with it on that side, and for shared sequencers and all the things that just never really played out.
Yeah, I do think maybe one final thing to mention we spoke about earlier before the show. Blockworks Research put out today the sort of Solana DEX share versus trading terminal share, and from memory, don't quote me on the numbers exactly, but the trading terminals are taking maybe 70% plus of the fees versus the underlying DEXs on chain. So maybe what that means, and Hyperliquid is going through something similar now with the builder codes, and potentially some of those terminals or apps or whatever end up accruing more value than Hyperliquid itself. Maybe those protocols, you're right, Mike, are they already seeing in real time? They're not building their own chain anymore. They're going one layer further and actually going closer to the end user. And so there's still going to be value that accrues to Ethereum as a platform. So these platforms or these great protocols already exist, like you're saying. It's not either or great infra or great apps. It's value accrue to different things in different ways. But I think we're seeing for the first time now, a lot of value accruing at the sort of end user layer. And so maybe if you're a protocol on chain, like a DEX or whatever it is, or a lending protocol, trying to get in front of users sooner rather than later, I think is maybe going to be a trend that we continue seeing as they start taking more and more market share. But let's see what happens.
Let's see what happens. Guys, I think we've got to wrap it here. This was, massively fun for me, even on first go here. And listeners, would love any feedback that you have. We've got a bell curve, a left curvers Telegram. So probably best way to drop feedback is hop in there and give us all feedback. But yeah, guys, Xavier, Myles, excited to do this with you guys. This was a ton of fun.
Super fun. If we ever get in the same time zone, maybe we can turn it into a cheeky pint, but we're working out of three different time zones and we don't want to ruin Mike's day. So
10 a.m. would be a little worrisome potentially, but all right, guys.
That was
see you guys
fun.
next week.
Yeah.
See you guys.